and we should begin. We welcome those of you that are joining with us, and there may be a few. We'll just see how that goes along. But what we want to talk about today is beginning with defining your purpose for your life stories and creating a life timeline. And please join us in the discussion. But I just like to present a couple ideas that may be helpful and that we've found helpful to others in preparing your life stories. I think preparing any kind of a situation where you're trying to communicate something important is you consider why you are doing this. And that's what we'll begin with talking about purpose. I feel that purpose is one of the most important things to consider ahead of time as you tell your life stories and as you're sharing the stories, whether it be about your own life or someone else, as to why you're doing this. What's the purpose for creating your life stories? Think deep. It takes some effort. And so consider why you're doing this and what you want to accomplish uh, through this. And one of the keys I think here is then to write that down, is to take the time to actually, even though it's in your mind and maybe clear in your mind, is to write down on a sheet of paper what your purpose is for doing your life stories. And whether it seems obvious or not, clarifying it on paper is really a very valuable thing. And it's something that you can change as you go. You can refine, you can add to. Uh, but having that purpose written down is very helpful for you. I know as we help other people, that's important so that we're exactly on the same page and going the same direction as what our clients want us to do. But found even individually, to have a statement of purpose as to why you're doing this will help center your thoughts and really refine your thinking. Just show you a couple of might say the various purposes that people have had for this. Of clients that we've talked with, and we've dealt with hundreds, and just thrown some various ones up here. Someone might have said, I've been wife and mom, but what happened to Sarah Jane? I want them, meaning her children and grandchildren, to know who I was before. That was a purpose of a woman, of showing that she wasn't always an old lady, but she had a young life and was active and vital, and she may want them to know that. And that's a wonderful thing about telling our life stories, is to share these other parts of our lives that may be different from who our audience may be seeing at the time. And you can have this as refined or comprehensive a purpose as you want, but again, very important to start with a purpose and make that clear in your own mind and make it clear on paper, because that's what this is about, is communicating on paper. To have your purpose clear to start with is quite important. The next, besides purpose, is your audience. Who is it that will read your book or watch your video? For who is this being made for? Who do you want to listen to this? Who are they? Think about what they care about, what they're like. What do they mean to you? And spend some time thinking about that, but also writing that down as well, because that will guide your voice as to who you are talking to. It'll bring out your authentic self. You don't want to sound like anyone else, whether that's in the way you talk or how that comes through as a printed word on a page. And by really clarifying in your mind and having that vision who you're talking to, that will help direct the way that you're speaking and how your story comes out. It's often nice to have a picture of those people, whether that be your grandchildren or children before you, as to deciding just who that is that you're talking with.
One thing I just would like to chime in here is when you're thinking about your audience, most of us are recording our life stories for people that we know, for our children, our grandchildren, our families, our loved ones, friends. There are some of us who may want to have a story that we want to sell, put it in a book for distribution to the general public. But for the most part, we're writing for people that we know. However, one thing you want to keep in your mind is that um, that people in future generations that you don't know yet may be also reading this story. you don't know, but that someone 100 years from now might be reading your book and be interested in your life. Um, and it may be, your great 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 grandchildren. So make sure that you keep that in the back of your mind as well, and that will help you as you tell your life stories. If there are things that need to be explained or things that you need to give more detail about, you'll have them in your mind as well.
Very good point. Thank you. So again, first purpose, second audience is very important as you go into a project like this, because it can be overwhelming, and this will help refine your thinking and direct your voice as to who you are talking to and what and why you are sharing these things. Next to that, or after those 2 points, is the scope, as to how big is this going to be? How much information are you going to cover? Uh, we often say that you don't necessarily need to tell your whole life story, at least not all at once. And so you want to look at the big picture, and then you want to narrow your focus and say, okay, at this point, I'm going to tell just this story. And Allison will talk about this a little bit more later as to how you may refine that. But first, you want to say, okay, how far do I want to go with this? How much do I want to cover in this particular project or chapter that I'm doing at this point, that you're writing about? And you may want to limit that. We say that should a life story be complete, comprehensive, and chronological? Well, not necessarily. They don't have to be any of those. And so that's where you want to begin to look at the scope that you have. And some of the best stories that we've seen have been taken from a particular limited point of view. A children's book, a woman, we helped write a children's book for her grandchildren. She wanted that specifically this book to talk to her grandchildren, to tell her about what her childhood was like, to share some of the stories as she grew up in a different part of the country, and what it was like growing up for her and in that area. I think one of the beautiful ones was it was the letters of a son back and forth to his mother while he was in World War II, stationed in Europe. And so this was not his whole life, but it was this little slice of this time during the war with this perspective of these two, mother and son, communicating. It was an absolutely beautiful, beautiful book. A favorite I had was it was a story. A woman came in that her father loved horses, and so she wrote some of the stories that her father's horses, and told about them, and then had the opportunity for some of the children to even draw pictures. Stories about living at a certain point in time, like living in Hollywood. Uh, One of the beautiful books, even though it was a fairly broad, large project, was examples of God's tender mercies. This was what an individual particularly set as a goal over 50 years ago, that he wanted to share those things. And for years, he kept a journal and then put that in a book. But again, it was focused on what he wanted to accomplish to who, and what really was the scope of his project. I did a book. Actually, it was one of my personal first, was some of my growing up years spending in a Jeep traveling through Utah and Colorado and as far north as Canada and even into Mexico. But it wasn't, again, my whole life. But I thought I just want to tell a few of the stories of growing up out in a Jeep. It can be really anything that you decide, but again, a key or an important principle here is to limit the scope as to what you're doing. And then of all these things, with purpose, audience, and scope, is to clearly define those and write it down, because that will be a guide to your efforts.
Just another thing I thought I'd interject here about thinking of the scope of your book. And we'll talk in a minute about doing a chronological overview of your life. But as far as narrowing it down to a smaller project, you can do a series of smaller projects rather than putting them all together in one large book. Um, some of the possibilities for scope are not only in a particular time period, but also a particular theme. You might want to, or a particular challenge that you've had. You may want to write something about your challenges in dealing with caring for an aging parent, or um, dealing with a battle with cancer, or any large challenge in your life, could make a really compelling book just on its own, and how you've dealt with those challenges. So there are any number of ways that you can tell your stories without having to start at the beginning with your birth and go up to the present time. You can take it one block at a time.
And again, the key, like in the kit that you would have received, is the cards that have purpose, audience, and scope. And whether you write it on these cards or just some place that's actually tangibly written down, you can see what you've written that can be edited, is to write down something to the effect of your purpose, why you're doing this, who you're doing it for. Get a picture of them and write that down. May even name names or look to the future, but describe who that is, and then on the scope. And again, it directs your thinking, but it also really has power to directing your voice and your emotion, and keeping you on track.
And it can kind of serve as a touchstone too, as you're going along and trying to decide which of all these possible stories do I want to tell. You can refer back to these purpose and audience and scope statements to sort of keep you on track. And you might find a great story about your mother when you were a little girl, but if you're doing a story that's later in time and that incident isn't pertinent to it, you might want to put that aside for a future project. So it's a good sort of touchstone to check and see how you're doing as you're going along, and um, if you're keeping with your stated purpose. And that doesn't mean that your statements, your purpose statement, can't change as you go along. You may get into a project and then really decide that you really want to take it in a different direction, and that's fine too. But it's a good place to start. Next, we want to talk a little bit about preparing a timeline, a life timeline, which we call a lifeline in the kit. And if you have the How to Save Your Life kit, there are a couple of really handy timeline sheets in there that you can use on which to do this. If you don't have the kit, there are any number of ways that you can create a timeline of your life and use that. The basic premise behind a timeline and creating a chronological overview of your life is essentially to have a place to capture ideas, story ideas, memories, these random fleeting things that come into your mind at sometimes inappropriate times and places. But it's a place where you can capture these things as they come in randomly, and you can put them in a chronological context. And it doesn't matter whether you're doing a limited scope life story project or whether you're doing a more comprehensive one. Even if you're doing one of a limited scope, it's still really helpful to have a chronological filing system, in a sense, for you to capture all of these ideas and have that in one place. So that is what we're going to talk about next. This is a quote that we like from Linus Pauling. He said, "The good way to get good ideas is to get lots of ideas and throw the bad ones away." So the idea behind creating a timeline is that you are creating lots of ideas, lots and lots, or gathering lots of ideas for stories, memories, random snapshots that might come to your mind of things that have happened to you along the way. And it's not that you're necessarily going to throw the bad ones away. They're parts of your life, and they're not necessarily any of them bad, but it will give you an overview so that you can then focus in on a certain time period, a certain theme, um, focus in on what you want to focus on for now, but then you still have all those other ideas that you might want to use for a future project. These are just a couple of examples of timeline formats. If you don't have the timeline that comes in the How to Save Your Life kit, there are a number of ways that you can do this. These are just a couple of timelines that people have done. You can also you can just grab a large sheet of paper and just start writing dates at the top. You could also do this in a notebook or a 3-ring binder. We talked to someone the other day who said that they had a 3-ring binder that had divider pockets in it, and Anytime they had an idea, they just wrote it down on a scrap piece of paper and put it in the divider pocket for that particular decade. Um, that's a way to do it. Anything that works for you is going to be good because then you'll actually use it. I like to sort of have everything on one big sheet of paper that I can look at. But if that doesn't work for you, and if you'd rather use a notebook where maybe you have a year written at the top of each page um, that you can carry with you, that's fine as well. Whatever makes sense to you. So generally, the first thing that we have you do with a timeline, whether it's a timeline sheet or a large sheet of paper or a notebook, is to loosely divide your life into chronological sections. And again, this is something that's entirely personal, and different people will do this in different ways. Some people like to go year by year. You can put a year starting from the year of your birth, or this also is important, just to digress for a second. If you are actually writing not your own life stories, but if you're writing a history about your parents or an ancestor or a family history, the timeline becomes even more important. So you can use this timeline for someone else's life as well, if that's what you're writing about. But if you're writing about your own life, you'd want to start probably around the time that you were born, and then you could go year by year, or you can go decade by decade. The one that's showing on the screen right now is a timeline that this is actually my timeline, or one of the timelines that I have used. That I've kind of broken it down into kind of life milestones for me, or where I lived at the time. I moved around quite a bit when I was young, and so my memories are very much connected with a sense of place. And I can remember approximately what year something happened because I remember where I lived at the time. So I've broken mine up into sections depending upon where I lived, or where I was in school, junior high, high school. So you can also divide your life by sort of life milestones as well. Again, it's completely personal, and whatever feels comfortable for you is how you want to divide that. And you can make further divisions as you go along. As you gather more information and you have them written down by decade, you may decide that you want to break that down. Again, this is just a place for you to randomly capture ideas as they come in, because we don't think chronologically. Our memories don't occur to us that way, and they sort of bounce off of each other. You may be thinking about you've got a timeline in front of you, and you're maybe trying to brainstorm ideas of things that happened to you when you were in elementary school. But then you may think about something that happened with your pet while you were in the second grade. And then that maybe might trigger a memory of another pet that you had later on in high school. And you don't want to lose that memory, even though you're out of the chronological time that you were working on. So you want to jump over to where you were in high school and write down that memory.
May I just add one thing? I think it's interesting as I listen to her talk about pets or elementary school or junior high or some of these things. As we're talking, or as someone is talking and we're listening, we're part of a conversation or hearing someone tell a story, it will remind you about things in your life. Say, oh, here's something that reminds you. So as we're talking here tonight, even for just these few minutes, as we may say something, anything that brings a memory to your mind, that may be something to add either to your timeline or to a note that you can write down. For instance, have you ever had a pet? What were some of the experiences of that pet? Have you moved? What was it like in junior high? What was it like in second grade? And I just throw these things out in that they spark these memories that will come, and that's really the purpose of the timeline. And this whole part of this project is to gather your own ideas. So as we say things that spark a memory in your own life, make a note.
Ooh, write it down. Thanks. One thing I'd like to mention too, as far as this timeline goes, is that you want to make sure that that you're using a format that you feel comfortable with. What we generally get tell people to do to get them started is to take that blank timeline or a blank sheet of paper, or what, even if you've already written some notes about memories in your life, get that in front of you and start with a single brainstorming session. Um, that's a good way to just get some ideas rolling. And generally, I like to just kind of sit down, put on some music. You can listen to music from the time period that, from your youth, or the time period that you're working on. That helps a lot to bring back memories. Or not, whatever you feel comfortable with. But find a place where you're away from distractions, where you can sit comfortably with this sheet in front of you, and just start jotting things down that come to your mind randomly, no matter where they are on your timeline. Just start jotting down little things. As you're writing things on your timeline, you want to make sure that these are only phrases of maybe a couple or a few words. You're not trying to write a paragraph about what happened or write the whole story. You just want to write down a few words that will remind you of what it is that you want to write about. So later on, there's one that I had from, let's see, for my second grade year. I remember missing a word on a spelling test, and I was so upset that I burst into tears. So I just wrote, cried, second grade, cried on spelling test. That's enough for me to remember that situation if I want to write it into a story later. So you're just dealing with very short phrases here, not long paragraphs or long blocks of information. So you're going to sit down, you're going to give yourself a brainstorming session. Usually I think about an hour is a good length of time, maybe even less. Once you get beyond that point, your brain just kind of starts getting fried. Um, but it's amazing. I think the things that you can see on this timeline on the screen on the first page, I did that in about 20 minutes. It really doesn't take as long to flesh out a lot of that stuff as you think that it might. You can remember a lot of things in 20 minutes. And what happens is that it sort of jump starts your brain and gets you thinking about all these things. And then later on, as you go on to the other things that you have to do in your life, and in the coming weeks, as you're working on these stories, other things will come to you because you've sort of gotten that process rolling in your brain, and your brain is going to be more receptive to memory triggers as you go along. So after you have that initial brainstorming session, just kind of put it aside for a while, and then you can come back to it. One thing that helps a lot, once the initial flow starts to slow down of just what's coming out of your brain, then is the time to bring in some memory trigger questions, things that will trigger memories in your mind or bring stories to your attention that maybe you had momentarily forgotten about. There are a lot of different a lot of different questions that you can use. In the How to Save Your Life guidebook, we have many pages of memory trigger questions. The key with these trigger questions is not to try to answer all of these questions as you go along. A lot of them won't even be pertinent to your life anyway. And some of them they might be pertinent, but they might not be that important to you. But read through the questions and see what that triggers. And maybe an answer to a question might trigger a memory that you say, oh yeah, I remember that. And now I'd really like to talk about that. So circle it, check mark it. You can always come back and answer the question later, but just to help get your memories flowing that way. If you don't have our kit or our guidebook, there are also a lot, or even to supplement that, there are a lot of online questions that you can find. Just Google oral history interview questions, and there will be all kinds of lists of questions that will come up. A lot of them have kind of typical questions, where were you born, and what was your mother's name, and those kind of things. And that's important genealogical information that should be included in your history. But sometimes they're not always the most interesting questions or the most thought-provoking. So get a variety of questions from different places and go through those and see what that triggers for you. We just posted a blog post on both the picturesandstories.com website, which is our custom website, and the How to Save Your Life website, with 25 really interesting thought-provoking questions that are kind of go beyond the sort of typical memory trigger questions. So you might want to check that out as well. Another thing that's really helpful is to use historical events to trigger events in your own life. Most of us can remember, if we're in the right age bracket, for instance, where we were when President Kennedy was shot, or when Martin Luther King was shot, or during 9/11, any of those sort of major historical milestones that were so shocking that most of us can have a pretty clear picture of where we were and what we were doing at the time. But also, it's really interesting to sort of go through a lot of the historical or political events that happened during your lifetime and see, did any of those really change your life in any way or change your thinking? What do you remember about those events, and how did they affect your life personally? The one that's showing on the screen is a historical timeline that Tom designed that is on the back of one of the Lifeline sheets in the kit. And that's got a lot of great just events that happened in the 20th century. There are also a lot of history timelines available online as well that you can look at. But jot some of those things down on your timeline as well and connect them to your own life.
Let me just add one thing here, and Allison may have covered this to a degree already, but one of the things that the historical events do is they will help remind you of things from your own life, but as you're writing your story, they may also help give context to the things that you're talking about. So as you talk about, like when 1969, when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, it gives this perspective to future generations as to what was happening in your life at the time, or where technology was at, or what the state of the world was, or your community, to give perspective to your own stories.
Another thing that is really important, because these memories will come to you in such a random fashion, and because that flow gets increased as you're going along into this project, is to carry something with you that you can capture your memories with as they come to you. The timelines that are in the kit are small enough that you could probably stick them in your purse or a notebook if you wanted to take that with you while you're working on your project. But if not, just carry a little notebook, and then you can transfer those things that you remember into your timeline. I keep everything in Evernote on my smartphone. So if I remember something as I'm going along, I will just create a note in Evernote and just type that, drop it in my little notebook of memories, and then I can add it to my timeline later. Very, very, very helpful. But you want to have whatever is the most comfortable for you, but you want to have something handy that you can keep those in when you are away from your timeline, because you never know when those memories are going to hit you. You could be driving somewhere in the shower, so, and you don't want to lose those things, because after a few minutes, something will come to your mind, and then you may forget it again a few minutes later. So, so carry that with you so you can remember them as much as you can. And as time goes by, continue adding those things that you capture when you're away from your timeline. You can have additional brainstorming sessions if you like, if that's helpful for you. But those ideas will continue to come. So keep adding them on your timeline and keep them all in one place, because that's going to be very important when you get to the point later on of deciding what of all of these things in your life, what you want to choose that's going to be the most important. You want to have everything in one place so that you can have this overview to look at. Next week, we are going to be talking about gathering your personal history assets, your pictures, your documents, letters, slides, all of that stuff that we keep. And we're not really going to focus at this point on what photos you want to add to a personal history, but on how these things, how you can begin to organize them, and how they can also serve as memory triggers. We've done several books for people where they have basically just gone through a pile of pictures and recorded their memories about these pictures, and we've actually created that into a book. So that in itself is a legitimate way to capture some of your life stories, is just to talk about some of the pictures that you have. But so that's kind of what our focus is going to be next week, on gathering those things. But as you go through pictures and other things, documents, things like that, be sure that when those memories come up, that you are also adding that information to your timeline. Tom, anything else you want to add?
Well, just that this is one of the most exciting areas, is that, and it can be overwhelming, and we'll talk more about this next week. But just start to, as we move into next week, and whether you join us in the webinar next week or not, but to start to think about what pictures you have, what documents, what are the elements of your life that you have in the form of images, pictures, journals, diaries, and we call these personal history assets because they are assets. They're important. You know, we think about our homes and stocks and bonds and financial assets, but these are some of the very important assets of your own life, of your experiences, of values, of things and people you care about, and places you've been, and they're a treasure to, one, bring back your memories, but also to share in the future.
I think at this point we will. Okay, got that. Oh yeah, my slide up here. Let's just go back this up for a moment. Just one last point is, as you're looking at these pictures, just make sure that you add those memories to your timeline as well. I think I might have already mentioned that. So I think at this point, why don't we open up for some questions, any concerns that you might have, anything that you've struggled with from this point on. If you have a microphone, you're welcome to just speak up. Hopefully that's not going to cause any issues.
Okay,
Or you can also type us. You
Trying to see if he could possibly pass Lehman here just for good measure, and he sends it.
Okay, we've got some in the background. I've turned all of your mics on.
Straight line distance from the top of the jump just to the sweet spot for landing is 100 feet. We went well past that. So moving on to the final, it will be Brady Lehman of Canada and.
Okay. If you have any questions, why don't you you can note, and we'd love to address your questions live. If we can, if you'll let us know, we'll turn the mics on. But type in your questions, or please respond through a chat, so that we can all make this time effective. Because truly, one of the best ways that we can create our own histories is by helping each other and listening to each other and giving each other ideas and sharing things that are going to be helpful. So we open it up to you at this point to share what's on your mind. Okay. I'm going to just open the mic again. Okay, anyone out there that has some questions you could, or comments?
That's insane. Yep, thank you, customer. I can download anything on it.
Seriously? That's a lot of music.
Seriously?
That's insane. And it's $15 a month for the family.
Seriously? That's a lot. Go.
Seriously, that's a signature. You don't have a signature. That's a signature.
Only AT&T brings you Beats Music. Unlimited down.
Okay. We've got all of your mics on, except one of you had a TV on in the background, which we could all hear, so I muted that particular participant. If any of you have any other questions that you want to ask, just go ahead and speak up, or you can type us a message. You know, while we're waiting for questions, just one other thing I will mention about creating a life timeline is that this is something that it's never really finished. At some point, you will get to the point where you look at your timeline and it's pretty full, and you think, I think I have most of the important things on here, and it's time to start choosing what stories are the most important for you to tell and pick a starting point for telling your stories or writing them. But that doesn't mean that you won't continue to have memories that you want to capture on there. And even as you begin the writing process, you will have more memories come to you, and connections between different things on your timeline will occur to you that maybe you didn't occur to you earlier, when you were thinking about these as single discrete events or elements. You may start to see connections with things that will bring up other memories. So a timeline is something that's never really completely finished, but at some point, when you have enough ideas that you can begin to work with, then you'll go through and start what we call story triage, which we're going to be talking about in a couple of weeks, where you really start to go through and say, okay, what are the most important things here that I want to talk about?
I'm going to take just a second and add a few things. Hope you've got a piece of paper and a pencil, or possibly even your timeline, or some way to make a note or two. Because as I look at this top book, I recall interviewing and talking with Lewis Moore, a fine gentleman from Dallas, Texas. And as you see on the picture of his book, there he is. I think he's 7 years old. In 1937, he took a road trip. And I think they went, it was like 1,700 miles, something to that effect, all around the country. So think about maybe a road trip you took as a youth. Does that spark a memory of yours? He talks about growing up in a town where the train came through, the railroad, and hobos would come, and his mother never failed to feed and take care of them. Think about your own mother, and how is she with other people, and maybe of service. Think about instances of your life. As I look at Faye Miles, the next book down, she spent a lot of time talking about her grandparents. What are some of your recollections about your grandparents? What do they mean to you? Maybe what experiences did you have? Did your grandmother bake bread on a wood-fired stove in a rural town? I mean, whatever they may be, maybe make a note or two of some of your experiences about a grandparent. What was it like when you went to college? I look at my life thus far. This is a wonderful lady, and she wrote her history all out in longhand and then had that typed later. So think about different elements in your life. We talked about pets, junior high. Think about some of those things in your life and let those, memories, come out onto the page, even like Allison said, just a word or a phrase. In the next few days, as you talk to people and have conversations over breakfast or lunch or at work or with family or whoever, you'll have conversations and you'll be relating things in stories. And it will bring things to your memory about your own life. We'll make some notes because some of those may be helpful as you begin to put your life stories together, because you'll be reminded of things that you didn't really think about before, but it will start to come up. And so think about some of those things.
Another thing that I just want to mention is really how much fun this process is. It is, you will learn so much about your life when you just start getting it all in one place. And it's just, you'll have a great time going back and just remembering things that you thought you'd forgotten about. It really is a fun and enjoyable adventure to do this process. So that's why, again, I would encourage you to, when you're getting started, take some time, go to a place where you're comfortable and where you don't have a lot of distractions, and just let your mind wander and take that trip down memory lane and just have a blast while you're doing it, because it really is. When I was doing a few brainstorming sessions, you just get caught up in it, and I had so much fun remembering some of those things that I hadn't really thought about for years. So it really can be a fun process.
Fun, and also say valuable. some people have asked if they should include their timeline in their book, and that can be a great thing. You may modify it or include certain things, but that can be a wonderful thing to show elements of your life in respect to just putting a timeline in your book. But it's at least it's a very helpful thing getting your own life stories and going back to what we talked about to start with. It's considering why are you doing this. So as you take all of those events, I think we'll talk about this more later too, but as how you'll take all of these events and look at them and say, now, what is the most important thing? What is the story that I need to tell now? Or maybe what's the one that comes easiest that I want to talk about? But this is the way that you can discover these nuggets of gold, or as we started out talking about Linus Pauling, these Nobel Prize worthy stories from your life. And the way to find those Nobel Prize worthy ones is to get a lot of them, because then you'll find the really beautiful, important ones as you start to get a lot, and find which ones are the special ones that really need to be shared with others.
Anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask? Any comments? Any challenges? Let me just address one fear that we've heard from several people, especially people who are in their more elderly years as they begin this process, and where we've gone in to do interviews with them. Quite a few times we've had people that say, my memory is just terrible. I just can't remember anything anymore. And yet when they sit down and begin this process, and when we start to ask them questions about their lives, it's amazing what they actually do remember. And they're almost always the people that say that and start out with some fear and trepidation about what they might be able to remember, are amazed at how much they can actually recall under the right circumstances. So you may be surprised at the flood of memories that come to you when you begin this.
Any other comments, questions? We'd love to hear from you and continue to email us. And as we talk next week about life story assets, which I think is a absolutely terrific topic and very, very important, we hope you can join us. But email us your comments, questions, or things that you'd really like us to cover, because we want these to be worthwhile to you. Your lives have great importance, values. I see some of the names here. I know, having talked with some of you, great people, fantastic lives, great stories that really need to be shared and saved for those that you care about and those that you really don't even know yet.
All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and end here. If nobody has any other questions or concerns that they want to address, we will be doing our next webinar next week, Tuesday at 10 o'clock Mountain Time, and also Thursday evening again at 7. And as Tom said, that will be on gathering life story assets and how we can use those as memory triggers. And so we will be doing those next week, and we will be sending you an email with the code. And also, if you know anybody else that you think might be interested in these seminars, let us know, and we'd be happy to send them an invitation with the code to get in. Because if you know anybody else who might be interested in this, they are welcome to join us as well.